My name is Lars and I will be your guide for today. The Trail Island, in Greenlandic we call it Sallinguit, and this is this area in general. And it has been recorded that there have been human activity in this area all the way back to 4,000 years ago. And you can see why, because this area, it forms a natural harbor. Most of these houses, or this whole area in general, is actually preserved because some of these houses are all the way back to the early colonial era. And now if you notice the entrance, there are usually two entrances. One for the colonial people and one for the servants. We're now approaching the area that is protected. So before we head out, I would like to remind you, please mind where you walk, and especially do not approach the dogs that are chained up, as they can be highly territorial. So now if you just follow me, and again, mind where you are, because we want to preserve this area as much as possible. We have some lovely kayaks down there. Now these kayaks are modernly built, usually by using glass fiber or carbon-based plastic. But in older times the Inuit people would use driftwood or any kind of woods here in Greenland, because we don't really have any trees. And they would make the exterior of pelts and skin. We're now approaching our first turf houses, and they can be quite obscure because they are in these green vegetation down there. Now the one on my right side is a turf house from the 19th century, and the other one close to me is a turf house built during the 17th century. You can notice that there's a bit steep area here, and that is usually where the entrance to the turf house would be. The reason why this area is steep, because during the winter the cold air would collect on this deeper area, and inside they would try to make sure that they can preserve the heat. The turf houses are usually built from rocks and turf, which means a dirt area, and they would usually build the roof using driftwood from Siberia. Turf houses are usually winter settlements. In the summer the Inuit people would also act as nomads, so they would go other places, and they would usually live in tents made from pelts and skin for the summer. To my left side you can actually see the first grave. I believe it was the Sakak culture. The Inuit people did not bury their people in graves like this. They would usually toss them to the sea, where they would hope that they would become hunting animals or get reincarnated. It was during the Thule culture that they began to produce these graves, and if you look inside, you can actually spot that the Inuit people would be buried in foster position. Now the reason why they do that is because they believe you are born into the world in a foster position, and then you would exit the world back in a foster position. It is also customary to name your children after your father or your grandfather, and it is curiously it is still a custom that is used today in most societies in Greenland. If you turn your attention to the area that has very green vegetation. Now, fun fact, if you spot islands like those, that would usually mean that there have been dog activities on this island. So ancient dog poo made sure that the vegetations are growing well. And the reason people do that because during the summer they would leave their dogs on an island where they would tend to them by giving them food, water to drink, and they would usually roam free on these islands. And it is still a custom that many applies to this day. The graves are usually very close to the settlement. The Inuit back then would be buried in their clothes and their tools with them, so they can better manage themselves in the afterlife. Now, there are three kinds of afterlife, three kinds of pillars that they can visit when they die. It would usually be the sila in the sea, in the land, and also on the air. If you noticed how tall these graves are and how high they are from the water, or they're usually at the peak of the mountain, that would usually mean that they want to make sure that the deceased would have good view from the land. This peat house here, it is built a bit bigger, and it is usually a settlement for a big family. And it has the same method as the turf house we saw earlier, with an entrance facing south, and more or less the same architecture, with an entrance buried deep so they can collect the cold air. Now they would usually sleep together naked to keep body warmth, and they would use pelts or skins as blankets. Now it is also curious because you have a very lovely view of the ocean here, or the water, and I can imagine during the 17th century the Inuit people here would look to this side or this side, and they would usually see kayaks and umiaks in the summer moving to an area they call Taseralik. Now the Taseralik was a gathering point for the Inuit people, the Greenlandic people, to gather, to exchange stories, to exchange hunting stories, and or perhaps getting some marriage along. And it is also curious to think about that the Inuit people perhaps saw the first missionaries arriving to the Sisimiut vicinity, so they could see the missionary ships arriving around this area. If you turn to my left side, you can actually see the long house, the long peat house, and it would be used for several families or one big family. And over to my right side, you can actually see the first smithy, and which is also called one of the first professional practice that has been done. And the reason why they used the smithy, because they were whale hunting during the colonial era. You can see the dog houses. That is where they would produce the whale blubber into whale oil. And next to it, where you can see where they would dry the fish, that is where they would gut the whale for further producement of the whale oil. The Inuit people would have a little garbage area where they would collect the bones, because the Inuit believe that it is sinful to be wasteful. Now remember at the start of the tour I said that you could trace activity all the way back to 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago. Here is actually where these activities have been found. The oldest culture in Greenland, Sakak culture. So they can find activity here that dates all the way back to 2,300 years before Christ, all the way to 1,200 years before the birth of Christ. The houses made of cobblestone behind me, those houses were actually very cold, so they were probably used as storage containers. Now these type of houses are usually used for preservation of whale meat and whale blubber, and in Greenlandic they are called gimatulivik. This is yet another one of our stop with some graves. 3 of the graves are possible Thule graves, and you can see 2 of them behind me, possible Thule. There's at least 2 people inside this one and the other. And now if you turn your attention to this grave here, it is a bit wider and longer than the typical graves that you can find during the Thule era. It is possible that this was a Christian grave because it is facing east. And the Christian would believe that your grave needs to face east, so when you awake, you would face the sun where Jesus was reborn. And you will find another grave here, again possible Thule culture, because there are several people inside of it. And from this view you can actually spot 3 skulls, 2 adults and 1 child. Now we are yet again in one of these gimatulivik, the cobblestone houses, and it is notable to see which one are well preserved, and the one with the roofs are the one that were used all the way to the early 20th century. And now remember, in part of my presentation I told you about where they would cook the whale blubber to produce the whale oil. It is very close by. It is actually right down there in the area I am pointing. So during the early colonial era, they would use this natural harbor to transport the whale itself for fletching, and they would transport the blubber here so they can produce the oil, and then they would cook it later on the area that I pointed out early in the presentation. And the water was also connecting rather than separating the community, the settlement and the industry. Here we see another one of the turf houses, and you can notice that this house is also trapeze formed, and this turf house is from the 17th century to 18th century, and it is also where you can see it more clearly compared to the rest of the turf houses. You can see the inner area of the house, and you can also see the sunken entrance a bit clearly for the cold water for the winter. And the entrance is also facing south. Now this concludes the tour of the Taylor Island.